tonight's program. First off, I want to welcome tonight's program will be moderated by Professor Paul Gaffney. He's an associate professor of English and the director of Eclectic Scholars Honors Program at Hiram College. He has studied and taught Shakespeare for more than 15 years. And he will be joined by Emma Smith. She is a professor of Shakespeare Studies at Oxford University and has published widely on Shakespeare and other gymnastics. And she's going to discuss her latest book, This is Shakespeare. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Emma, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Much more this evening for you, I suppose. But I think we'll enjoy a little bit of time here with the fine people of Hudson. I will tell you, I am not a Shakespearean myself. I'm a medievalist, but because I teach at a small college, I end up teaching Shakespeare quite a bit. So I've actually kind of learned much more about Shakespeare through the process of trying to teach other people about him.
Me too.
Well, I suppose, yeah, that's right. But so I come at it from a little bit different perspective than some of my Shakespearean friends. I have a lot of friends who are more directly Shakespeare scholars. But that being said, really appreciated your book and how it's put together, and it did raise a lot of questions for me. But the first one, and maybe the most obvious question, is why another Shakespeare book for the general audience? It seems that there are quite a few, and many of them are not by Shakespeareans, unfortunately, too. I think particularly of the Bill Bryson book from some years ago, which was, I thought, particularly bad, but I guess.
Okay, that's a really good question. I didn't dislike the Bill Bryson book perhaps as much as you did. Yeah. So I wanted to write. I wanted to write for a more general audience. I think lots of academics hanker after that, and Shakespeare is perhaps one of the few contact points between sort of academic work and other more popular forms of enjoyment, or in fact non-enjoyment of Shakespeare. I suppose part of what I thought was, everybody knows what this is, and they might have a negative view about it or a positive one, but that's a good start for a conversation. You know what it is I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And I had developed a series of lectures that actually, I should say, if you don't want to buy the book, get the lectures which are free to listen to from the University of Oxford. They're called Approaching Shakespeare. They were the basis of the book, and it was because they were surprisingly listened to very far beyond my own students, that I thought, oh well, maybe there's a bit of space here, and maybe there's some space that's a little bit different from the kinds of books that tend to be written about Shakespeare for a wide audience. And I think they tend to be either historical books, so I'd think of the brilliant work by James Shapiro or Stephen Greenblatt. They're broadly kind of historical, or they tend to be theatrical. They tend to be about people who access them through their own talents as actors or directors. And I wanted to do something which is a bit more what we do in kind of literature departments, and I'd be interested in what you think of this, Paul, but just something a little bit more like what's literary. What is it that we do when we read? What is literary criticism when it isn't history? It's not theatre studies. It's a way of thinking and asking questions about what we read. That seemed worth trying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I have to say I enjoyed many of the lectures that Oxford University Press, many of the lectures you've done. I found them very useful ways to think about some of the plays, and that really kind of feeds into maybe one of your central ideas in this book, which is that this is about gappiness, this great term that you came up with, that gappiness expresses Shakespeare's ambiguity or the kind of openness of the plays. You're right. These gaps are conceptual or ethical, and they open up space to think differently about the world and experience it from another point of view. That Shakespeare's plays are spacious texts to think with. I really think that's true. But why do you think that scholarship has often kind of gone in the other direction, tried to fix the meaning of the plays?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So I think we've all been in a kind of mutual pact somehow that non-specialists have felt we don't understand Shakespeare and it's too difficult, and specialists have felt, haha, we do understand it and this is what it means. And the education system has sort of gone along with that, really, and said, in order to pass this exam or this stage, you need to understand what this means. And here's the sort of crib or the answer sheet that tells you. So I think we've all gone along with that. And I suppose I was trying to think that often the questions we have about Shakespeare that seem to be questions of understanding, why does this happen, or why does this character behave in this way? They're often not actually straightforward comprehension questions at all. They're about that they sort of home in on places where the play doesn't give us the answer. We don't really know why, for example, Lady Macbeth behaves as she does. We're not told that. We might intuit that. We might bring to it our sense of why a woman in her position might behave as she does, but that's not really already there in the play. And into that space, we can, project different possibilities. And I think that's something that Shakespeare's plays perhaps uniquely offer. And because of that, they are kind of permissive, and they are open to us. So I suppose my big argument in this book is, you don't need to sort of find out the answer to things. But you sort of need to trust the questions, trust yourself with your questions. And if you're saying, I don't really understand what this character is saying, usually it's because the character is not being honest with themselves, or is not being clear about what they're trying to do, and what you're picking up is exactly the important thing about that particular moment in the play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right, absolutely. Well, and also I think we have this idea that you need to fully understand all the nuances of every word in order to really enjoy or get something from Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think that's a real quite a crippling kind of myth. I think it's not helped. Sometimes if people ask me how they should read Shakespeare, I tend to say don't look at the footnotes, or don't even look at an edition with footnotes, because once it's like it's being on a high wire and you look down and you're finished, really. You look down to the footnotes and you suddenly think, I don't understand any of this. Even the bits I thought I understood are about something, quite different, or very erudite or very learned. I think they're very de-skilling, and what they take away actually is the fact that nobody ever understood all these plays, every word of them. No Elizabethan could have glossed Hamlet's speeches with full understanding. Now, I wonder whether actually going to the theatre in that period was a bit more like, going to the opera, or going to a musical, or going to a concert or something. It had some elements of it which were not quite representational, were almost a bit more abstract. You listened to them and you thought, that guy's angry, or that guy doesn't know which way to turn, but you didn't perhaps need to understand every single word. And that's something I think scholars, myself included, have got a lot to answer for there, because we've tended to say, yeah, every single word is important, every comma is important, and unless you've got that, unless you're steeped in it, you can't get the full meaning. I'm trying to step back a bit from that kind of preciousness, actually, and think I'm not sure that's actually true. And sort of related to that, I think it's fantastic when directors cut these plays. I think it seems heretical to say it, but I think they're much too long for most modern audiences. And cutting I know you're interested in Shakespearean films, Paul, and sometimes what's so great about Shakespeare on film is just the way it's been reshaped to make a narrative that's 110 minutes rather than 200. There are some kind of brilliant pieces of sort of compression and reshaping. So I suppose that's another way in which I'm not so on board with this. The idea that every single tiny detail of this is vital. I think that's just overwhelming for most of us.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, when I teach Hamlet on film, I'm never quite sure what to do with Branagh's Hamlet, because I think it's almost kind of a stunt to try to get every word in there.
Yeah. Yes, if anybody's sort of seen that film, Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, it's 4 hours of your life you won't get back, and not only does Branagh include every line from the different early texts that may have been Shakespearean, so he sort of has a composite text, but he's also got. One of the reasons I realize it's such an exhausting film to watch is he casts every single bit part as a major actor. So you never get that moment that I think we all have in films where we sort of husband our interest. We economize on our sort of empathy by thinking these are not very important people. This is not the main actor. I've never heard of these people, so I can just let go for a minute. In Branagh's Hamlet, you can never do that because everybody from the gravedigger to the player queen is a kind of Oscar nominee, and it's a kind of exhausting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Branagh's Hamlet is the complete opposite of what I was saying about films usually needing to cut and reshape.
Yeah. Whereas most of the versions of Hamlet are maybe half the text or something. The film versions.
Yeah.
Really cut them severely.
Yeah, and if you look at work by a brilliant filmmaker like Orson Welles or something, we're getting about 30% of the lines of Shakespeare.
Too, I think. Yeah. But that does remind me of another question, kind of related, I guess. I noticed that you have of the 20 plays in the book, 3 are officially history plays. And I wonder if this is one of the kind of slight problems for Shakespeare plays, that it can be difficult for contemporary audiences to really take in many of the history plays and much of their complexity. And maybe one answer would be doing more severe cutting, as you suggest. But is there a place for many of these history plays in regional theaters today, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So Shakespeare writes 8 or 9 history plays over his career, and many scholars group most of them into 2 groups. A group that goes from the reign of Richard II through the 2 parts of Henry IV and into Henry V. And the other is the 3 parts of Henry VI going to Richard III. So that's already a bit of a problem, that they are overlapping or serial plays. One British theatre director calls them Shakespeare's box set, which is quite nice. I'm not sure that you do need to know what happens in all the previous episodes, but it can feel as if you do. You'd be a brave person to go and see Henry VI Part 2 as a sort of standalone play. So I think there are. These are plays about politics, really, rather than about history. Politics is something we're always interested in. I certainly think the American context has got more from the Roman history plays, and perhaps the British context is more interested still in the medieval English history plays. So I picked Richard II, which is a sort of a tragedy play where I was talking about how difficult it is to know this is a play about taking sides, really, and Shakespeare doesn't do that, and so that's one of the gaps, that quality of gappiness that Paul mentioned. I talk about Richard III and how he is he is the sort of bad guy hero, the charismatic hero of the play, and that even though he has to be defeated in the end by the forces of history, by the forces of the Tudors, who are Elizabeth I's dynasty, it's done in such a kind of low-key way that if you were cast as Richmond, who is the man who beats Richard III at the end of Bosworth Field, you'd be really, to use I think a British phrase, you'd be really pipped. You'd think, I've got a terrible part in this play. I'm only on for about the last 5 minutes. So I may be the sort of moral hero, but I'm I'm a kind of theatrical no mark. So I mean, I think there are lots of ways to think about those standalone history plays. But I do feel, although I don't myself think that you need to know a lot of history in order to appreciate them, I think they are a bit weighted down by that idea that you do need to know a lot of history. I know certainly when I teach American students, they feel this is something that British people just know about, and they don't. And sometimes when I teach British students, they think this is something the Elizabethans knew about, and I don't. And probably neither of those is quite true. I don't think the Elizabethans were particularly clear about what happened 200 years previously, but they are using the history to talk about contemporary affairs. These are contemporary plays for the Elizabethans, and I think they work best for us when they are also contemporary to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The end of Richard III, it almost feels like the end of Hamlet, where you don't really care that much about what's going to come next, even though
absolutely
point.
Yeah, completely. And it is a sort of you can see why it sort of gets to the end of history in a way. There's no even though history itself continues, the theatrical form of history is over because the characters can't carry the story.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay, so I did wonder about the idea of gappiness, which I'm definitely going to use in teaching, but it seems to me that some of the plays are certainly gappier than others, if you will. That there's like Richard III. It's about a lot of things, but it's definitely about how scheming your way to the top is not going to pay off in the end, or something like that. But you don't have the same ambiguity as you do in Lear or Hamlet or other plays.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess Richard III is about how scheming your way to the top isn't going to work, except that it's a play which suggests scheming your way to the top is fascinating and compelling, and everybody will watch you and love you while you do it. So, I mean, in certain kind of ethical systems, that might seem to be a very, quite a good life. Mm-hmm. So I suppose, I mean, you're absolutely right that in some ways the reason we've enjoyed those great tragedies is because of their ambiguities, and we've thought that is a part of their sort of awful beauty, and maybe other plays aren't so sublime or aren't so significant. But I guess I was trying to think about a way gappiness it affects all of the plays, and in some ways it's because they are plays, and what we are reading are scripts. And if we talked about Shakespeare's plays as scripts, we would be always more conscious of the things we're not seeing, and the things that would add meaning, not just scenery and setting, but particularly actors and who plays different roles, and what how that affects the meaning of the play. We were talking the other day about The Taming of the Shrew, which is a very, very problematic play about gender relations. Some people would say a deeply misogynistic play about wife beating. Others might have a slightly different view. But we were talking about how different it is if Petruchio, who is the man who Catherine is sort of really made to marry, how different it is if he is cast as a sort of eligible, good-looking actor. Now that's a very, very superficial thing to say, and that shouldn't matter, but it actually does matter in the ways in which we make meaning from that play. So the gaps, I think, are there at different levels in all the plays. I think there's room in all of the plays for us to kind of get in and kind of turn around a bit and make the plays our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's right. I think that some of the pleasure of something like Titus Andronicus or Richard III, which are perhaps not quite as sharp of plays, but is the showiness of them in a way that he's showing off, particularly in a scene like the wooing of Anne, which just shouldn't work, but somehow if you read it right or if it's performed well, it's just this incredible bravado that's going on that you have to kind of admire.
Yeah, it's a great scene. So Richard is they're in front of a coffin, and the woman weeping there is weeping for her father-in-law. Richard is involved in his death. He's also involved in the death of the woman's husband. And in this from this very unpropitious kind of moment, he turns a kind of a seduction, and Anne either agrees or can't disagree, or takes the path of least resistance, or is mesmerized somehow by him, and agrees to his proposal. And I've always thought, it comes quite early in the play, it's about sort of 20 minutes into the play, and I've always thought Anne is a sort of stand-in for the audience. We're all being wooed by Richard, and we've all got this moment at the beginning when we decide, are we going to go with him or not? And of course we do, like she does, and that perhaps means that we can't judge her particularly harshly for her behavior, because it's exactly what we are doing too.
That's very nice. I like that. Yeah. Well, one thing that a larger thought I had as I read through this is that in many ways it seems that much of your approach reminds me more of a theater kind of approach to Shakespeare than literary scholars. Not that that's a bad thing, but theater has long been very open to cutting, to eliding, to modernizing some words or whatever they have to do to make a production work, because the production has to make sense in a way. It has to come together and then be legible for the audience.
Yeah, I hadn't quite thought that, but I see what you mean. I mean, I've learned a lot from being in rehearsal rooms with people working on texts, and for the kind of questions that they ask of those texts, and the ways actors need to understand how it is they are saying something in order to convey that to audiences. But in some ways, because of that, theatre is distinctly sort of ungappy. I mean, theatre rehearsal tends to be the gappy times when actors and director sort of play with the text and think about the meanings. But by the time you get to performance, usually some of those holes at least have been kind of filled in order to be able to convey something a bit clearer and a bit more punchy to audiences. So when, for example, I talk about moments that could be taken in two quite different ways, it's not usually possible to convey that in a theatre production, because you tend to have to develop a reading up to that moment, which makes one or other, or one of the many possible readings, the more natural from the story that you've been telling. And it's not. If you say, well, it could be this or it could be that, which is one of the things I most like about Shakespeare, that tends to be fuzzy or a bit confused in the theatre. So I think, definitely, I've learned from theatre, and I think that's a really smart way to put some of those methods together, which I hadn't thought. But there's another part of me which is saying, if you really want to be free with Shakespeare, you need to read him, because those theatre directors are another version of those kind of authority figures who are telling you what to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Well, I guess I say that to students, is that a production is an interpretation. It's kind of, you have to have productions that don't have a point of view, I think, often don't work out well. See that. I saw a Hamlet a couple of years ago that was well done in many ways, but it just seemed to not really have a purpose to it. It didn't really hold together very well. But then I was in Stratford-upon-Avon in 2016 maybe. They did that amazing Hamlet that year, set in a post-colonial African country.
Oh, with Papa Seydu.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was there with some alums, and one of them had two teenage sons who came with us, and they'd never been to any theater at all, live theater, and we saw that Hamlet, and the one young man just instantly became a Shakespeare fan.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Changed his life.
Yeah.
Production.
Yeah, I think that's really exemplary, and it's absolutely true. People sometimes argue just across the board that Shakespeare was meant for performance, and therefore we should encounter him in the theatre. And there's two that's true in lots of ways, but there are two sort of slight pushbacks. One is that Shakespeare was also always read. The plays go into print while Shakespeare's still writing. There is a market, quite an eager market, it seems, for Shakespeare, reading Shakespeare from the 1590s, from really early onwards. And I guess the second reason is, sometimes theatre is boring. And sometimes it's fantastic and electric and wonderful, and sometimes it's quite boring. And I think Shakespeare can drag a bit. I talk in the book about the problem I think Shakespeare has with Act 5, which sounds a very sort of classical and technical thing, but if you think it's about, I think it's about quarter past or 9 in the evening. You've been there already for nearly 2 hours. You're starting to think, I can see what's going to happen. Can't we just sort of fast forward a bit? That's, strange things happen. Hamlet, meets the pirates or something. You just think, oh, Shakespeare, you've lost it really. Can't you're spitting it out. And I think, sometimes theatre, as I say, and as you're saying, sometimes theatre can completely open people's eyes, and often it's great for young people, really great, but it's got to be a really good production. Otherwise, it reinforces the idea that this is pretty slow.
That's true. Yeah, that's really true. It can be deadly, unfortunately. But I do think that's partly why there's a place for things like The Hollow Crown, or Chimes at Midnight, these kind of adaptations of the material.
Completely. And I think, Shakespeare himself was adapting all the time. He was adapting his own work. He was adapting the work of other people. I think he would have understood very clearly that sort of cutting and reshaping and restaging that's so important and inventive for modern adaptations. I think, I often think that that's a really great way in. There's no point if you're sort of keen to get young people to read Shakespeare. I mean, in some ways, I think this is a bit of a sort of moral panic in a way, and it actually doesn't matter. Young people need to read. You just need to love reading, and they should read whatever they want, so long as it makes them think, reading is just a great place to be, because then they'll read and do stuff later. That's just fine. I think probably we make young children too young read Shakespeare, certainly in Britain. there are not many people I meet who say, yeah, I was really turned on to Shakespeare at school. That's, despite the very inventive and creative teachers that there are on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think, introducing via smart adaptation is a really, is a great way to get people interested in the stories, in the sort of dilemmas, in the characters, which is what's, I think, at the heart. I think for me is what's at the heart of Shakespeare's plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. To the point about his early reading public, you also mentioned this idea that they are not necessarily reading the plays right the way through, that they dip into them, and that you don't have to be committed to just slogging through a play if you want to have a look at it. I like that. That's true.
Yeah, we're getting the first, around this time, so around the year 1600, we're getting the first books of quotations, printed books, which have, done the hard work of reading for you, and you can just get the best bits, the kind of the flowers, the word, the anthology. The word anthology meant bunch of flowers or something, and you've got the flowers, and there are a couple of books in 1600 that Shakespeare is quoted in. So we can see that process being commodified, if you like. So you don't even have to bother to read it to get the good bits out. But yeah, reading for what we call commonplaces. So these are well phrased little nuggets, little quotations, and you're mostly using them. If you're a 16th century reader, you're using them to model well-balanced phrases or sort of nice turns of phrase. Sometimes you might be importing them wholesale into your own letter writing or something. One of the marked up books, early books that I most enjoyed was a copy of Shakespeare's first Folio, which was published in 1623. And the first play in that book is The Tempest. And there are lots of sort of wonderful, famous quotations from The Tempest. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Our revels now are ended. Whatever those kinds of moments. And in fact, this reader was not interested in those at all. And you can see that perhaps you don't have much call for that kind of talk really in your normal life. You wouldn't read through that and think, well, that might be useful if I'm ever giving up my magic or something. But rather, this reader has gone for a scene that we would hardly look at now, the scene when the shipwrecked prince Ferdinand first sees Miranda, and he has some quite cheesy, actually chat up lines, and you can see this young. I imagine him as a young reader thinking, these are going to be diamond. These are going to be great when I have the chance to use these, and sort of feverishly copying them out as useful work. So, in some ways, that's similar to our the much more modern idea of quoting from Shakespeare, or having a Shakespeare slogan on a T-shirt or a mouse mat or something. But it's also about using Shakespeare for your own purposes, which is, I guess, exactly what my book is trying to encourage.
Very good. Well, we do have some questions, so maybe we should turn in
Wonderful.
that direction. Oh yeah, so we have a question which you must have answered before, asking how this is like or unlike negative capability.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Connor. Yeah. So negative capability was the idea from the poet John Keats, which was essentially, just to remind you, was that the artist, the great artist, is uniquely able to see sort of both sides, or see around an issue. And Connor says, is gappiness, how similar is it to that? I think what's different, Connor, is actually perhaps a slightly. I'm part of a tiny part of a larger shift in sort of literary interest, in that I think we have become less interested in the author as the generator of meaning and more interested in readers as the generators of meaning. So a book makes sense because readers make it make sense, not because the author does. And I guess that's a helpful way to see the difference between negative capability and gappiness, because negative capability is a property of the author. So it's saying, wow, this guy, and usually is a guy, this guy is a genius. Look at how amazingly he kind of sort of thinks of everything, or comes at this not from a single perspective. I suppose, I do think Shakespeare's a genius, although I'm not entirely sure what that would mean. But I don't think gappiness is saying, wow, look how Shakespeare has left all these amazing holes for us to fill in. It's less authorial than that. I think it's saying, what's the space for us as readers in Shakespeare's plays? Let's open up some of these, the crack that lets the light in, or something. Let's try and just find a space for ourselves in it. So gappiness is the property of the reader, and negative capability, I think, is about the author. And if you're more interested in interpretation, working out what did the author think, or how did the author encode things in his writing, negative capability would be a good framework. And if you're more interested, as I am at the moment, in how readers might take part in, participate in, or even complete literary works, then gappiness works better for me.
I wonder what you think about whether Shakespeare cared about his readership. It's not clear to me that he really thought much about being read as opposed to being seen on the stage.
It's really tough, isn't it? So we used to think that he didn't care about it at all. And then there's been quite a strong argument in recent years that, in fact, he did care about it. And where we have, as in certain cases, a longer and a shorter early version of a play, we have that with King Lear, we have it with Henry V. Maybe Shakespeare was releasing into the print market a version that was actually too long to be performed, in order that readers could, spend more time with it and enjoy it in a different way. That's an interesting idea. But I think one of the things that most strikes me about Shakespeare's biography is that when he goes to London, say around 1590. We don't really know. He's trying to make it as a playwright or an actor. In quite a turbulent time for the theatre industry. There are lots and lots of different small companies, and they're all vying in this new market for which companies are going to survive. It must have been quite a difficult time to try and to be a sort of country boy coming up to London to try and make your fortune. And even worse, the theatres close because of the plague. Something we have become very conscious of. And during that period, Shakespeare writes the first two works of his to go into print, and they're both poems, not plays, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, The Rape of Lucrece. Now, these are really best-selling works. They're really popular. They keep being reprinted. They're probably in print the most popular of Shakespeare's whole output. And I kind of think if you'd asked an Elizabethan about Shakespeare, who Shakespeare was, they would have probably said the one who wrote Venus and Adonis. But as soon as the theatres reopen, as soon as he gets his foot in the door with the Lord Chamberlain's men, as they are formed in 1594-5, Shakespeare never does that again. He never writes poetry. He never writes poetry again. And I think that, if you want to be the dominant sort of lyric voice in your writing, you probably write poetry. If you are willing to be one voice among lots of others, you probably work in the theatre. And that seems to me where Shakespeare really found his sort of centre of gravity. So yeah, I think you're right. I think theatrical performance was at the heart of what Shakespeare was doing.
What's that question from Ben? Oh, let's see. This is a longer question. Shakespeare had many famous contemporaries, such as Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe. or Ben Jonson, their plays are rarely performed or taught in schools. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, why aren't we performing Marlowe or Ben Jonson? Why aren't we teaching them? Why aren't we filming them? Is it because they're no good? It's not because they're no good. And in some ways, I think this question probably gets to the darker side of what I've been saying about Shakespeare's adaptability and the gappiness. That's to say, because of the feeling that we can keep reinterpreting Shakespeare in different ways, he does kind of take up quite a lot of space, particularly in the UK theatre world. One might well think, instead of doing a version of, a kind of gangland version of Romeo and Juliet, why not do a modern play about gang violence? Why not give a new voice who wants to say something about the 21st century or something? Why not do that? And that Shakespeare may be not only pushing out his contemporaries, but pushing out our contemporaries by seeming to be so contemporary. So the long history of how Shakespeare came to sort of push all the others out, I think is quite a sort of complicated one, but it's certainly not the case that he was seen at the time as being head and shoulders above the rest. The lists, the praise we have for Shakespeare is always in lists of other dramatists who are worthy. It may be that these dramatists were more topical and more of their time. If you look at Shakespeare alongside his contemporaries, he actually sometimes looks a bit old-fashioned or a bit out of time, a bit fairy tale. He never writes an absolutely contemporary play, where contemporary setting comedies are one of the great mainstays of the theatre in his period, but he doesn't do that. He's writing this kind of rather old-fashioned fairy tale romance when other writers have got something a bit more cynical. Don't think Shakespeare really does cynicism all that well, although he has a go perhaps in Troilus and Cressida or something. So it may be that Shakespeare's plays were not timely in his own time, and these other writers were, and because of that, they are stuck there, and he has kind of floated off into ours. You're right. The comparison with music is really interesting. We don't listen to the music of a single best composer like John Dowland. That's absolutely true, but nor is John Dowland in terms of the kind of cultural weight anything like Shakespeare. So there is something about the investment we put in Shakespeare, perhaps the overinvestment that has as a consequence the silencing of certain other voices.
Yeah, I think it's also true, though, and particularly in America, that the Shakespeare that is performed is a dozen plays, typically, maybe, and maybe 4 or 5 most intensely. We know a kind of very limited version of Shakespeare, often outside of major, very large cities or large Shakespeare organizations.
Could I just pick up something that would follow on from what I said you don't consider the sonnets poetry? I do consider the sonnets poetry. That I suppose what's different about Shakespeare's sonnets is we don't know that he organized them to be printed. So in some ways, it's back to Paul's the question that prompted all that discussion was Shakespeare interested in having his works printed? And I think it's clear that he was interested in having these early poems printed. We don't know about the plays, and I think we don't know about the sonnets. But yeah, of course, the sonnets are poetry. Sorry, I slightly misspoke that.
I do think the sonnets perhaps are not gappy in the way that the plays are. That and the narrative, well, maybe Venus and Adonis a bit, but maybe because they're
yeah, I think I would agree with you, and I think that does suggest that in some ways gappiness is a product of theatre and of dialogue and of a decentered, or the absent narrator, or the shifting point of view, which is so crucial to drama, and not so crucial to, even though Venus and Adonis is like a sort of extended dialogue, there's a lot of speech in it. Yeah.
This last question is interesting in light of that, I think.
So there's some a couple of questions about audiences and sort of early modern things. Maybe we could take the question about Edward's question about audiences and Julie's question about political or social issues of the day. So I mean, I think Shakespeare's writing for most of his career for a relatively broad, socially broad audience, perhaps not as broad as we sometimes idealize it, not least because plays are performed during the day when, if you're a working person, you're at work, and you do have to pay to go in, and if you're apprenticed or indentured labour, you perhaps actually don't have any cash. You're not part of a cash economy. So there may have been a little bit more of the middling sort than the absolute working people, probably more dominated by men rather than women, but both sexes there, and probably dominated by younger rather than older people, but again a range of ages. One interesting thing that happens to Shakespeare's company is that they develop an indoor theatre really quite a long way into Shakespeare's career. So right up by the later tragedies, by perhaps Coriolanus, something like that, around 1608. And this new theatre, Blackfriars, is indoors. It has to use artificial light. It uses candlelight. And that has lots of influences on the kinds of plays that are performed. I sometimes think that if you read about the way film stock developed at the end of the 1930s and the way light effects could work and shooting could be done in low light, what you get then is all those wonderful kind of film noir, shadowy kind of dramas, and it's partly technical. It's sort of spiritual and ethical and tonal, but it's also technical. And I think something similar happens in Blackfriars. You get a concentration of plays on set indoors, claustrophobic, psychologically or socially, perhaps both claustrophobic, particularly tragedies of sort of political corruption, social corruption. And Shakespeare is sort of on the edge of that, but doesn't quite do it. And I should have said the other thing about Blackfriars that's really important is it has many fewer seats, perhaps about 250 as opposed to about 2,500, and it's much more expensive. So it's a more elite audience, and it's sometimes given by theatre historians as the moment when theatre begins to go up market, and a kind of movement from which it's never recovered in many people's eyes. But Shakespeare's doesn't seem to work towards Blackfriars. I don't think he changes his writing all that much to account for that. So mostly he's writing for that globe, or that sort of outdoor audience. And Julie asks, how did he use his works to comment on political and social issues? I think that's a really interesting question. I think Shakespeare was popular in his own day because he was entertaining. People did not want to pay to go to hear a sermon or hear a kind of part of a little broadcast any more than they probably mostly want to do now. So I think that and he's also very clever in keeping out of trouble in quite a potentially sort of hot-tempered times. Other playwrights like Ben Jonson, who we talked about before, and Marlowe possibly, are in trouble. There are problems about what they write, and they have to pay the consequences for that. And Shakespeare's good at keeping one step ahead of that, even when his play Richard II, that Paul and I already talked about, which shows a king being overthrown by a challenger, even when that play is put on on the eve of a rebellion against Elizabeth, the Essex Rebellion, Shakespeare somehow doesn't get into trouble for it. He's able to keep away from it. So I think there is a distance from direct political comment, but all the history plays are about regime change. They're all about fantasies of the end of Elizabeth's reign. They're all political commentary at a time when it's not possible to think about who is going to be Elizabeth's successor. All the comedies are about models of social interaction. They're about the roles of men and women in the household, and about masters and servants in the household, which was a very a contemporary issue discussed in scores of guidance books and conduct books and a whole raft of literature. So I think there are lots of points of contact between the plays and those wider issues. But I think the entertainment value is why people went to the theatre.
I do wonder, you read about how Richard II at least allows for questioning of maybe divine right of kings. And I wonder if maybe Shakespeare wouldn't have written that under James because of James's very outspoken championing of that idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, one of the things that happens to Richard II in the Jacobean period is that the scene in which Richard gives up his kingship and the symbols of his office to Bolingbroke, to his challenger, that scene is never printed in the Elizabethan period, and some people think that what was important about that in the Jacobean context was that it was an act of Parliament, and one of the things James was not good at was Parliament. And if you know anything about English history and about our Civil War, you'll know that the crack between the King and Parliament, which is going to take the life of James's son and successor, Charles I, starts to open at this point when James is so disregards Parliament. So I think you're absolutely right that that's a play that's entangled in a way with sort of contemporary governance. Yeah. So Gary, if I asked about why I included certain plays, I'm afraid we've only got a few more minutes, so it can't get too bad for me even if I admit it. I don't actually like As You Like It. So As You Like It, not very much in my case. I think it's too static and too samey. There isn't enough. I mean, I think it's about. I do get that it's about nothing happening, but I find that's a bit too much for me. Henry V I would have liked to have included. It's a play I love, and it's a play which I think would have fitted the central thesis very well. So I picked some plays that I thought would need to be in any sort of 20 Shakespeare plays, and some that I thought could stretch out the time or the range of things to talk about. But yeah, I had no hesitation about leaving out As You Like It, but I had a lot of hesitation about leaving out Henry V.
I think we have time for one more question this evening.
Can I do two really quickly? Rachel, I don't want to avoid your question, which is really important, actually. Do Shakespeare scholars consider Merchant anti-Semitic? I think the history of Merchant of Venice shows that it has been used extensively in deeply anti-Semitic contexts, and it's gathered more anti-Semitic resonance, I think, in the years since it was performed. I wrote an article which I think I still stand by, which says that in fact Jewishness was not at that time a particular threat to English audiences. They were not this was not a particularly actively anti-Semitic moment, and that therefore perhaps we're looking in retrospect, a very, very important retrospect. But I certainly think it's impossible to separate this play from the long and shameful history of anti-Semitism. And I think any production of that now would need to face up to that. It's almost impossible to imagine a Shylock who was not Jewish, I think now, who was not a Jewish actor. And if I was recommending for someone who's a first-time reader of you, Macbeth, every time.
Yeah, that is a great one for a new reader.
For a first-time reader or someone who's looking to get into it.
Yeah, Macbeth or Much Ado About Nothing. If you're more inclined to, if you want everyone to be married, go for that. If you want everybody to be dead, go for Macbeth.
And I really think my preference would be thinking about high schoolers. One question addresses if there's any way they could be exposed to a performance first, in this case, rather than reading it. I'm not against reading Shakespeare, clearly, but I think too often we are just given a paperback copy of the play and told to dig into it.
Yeah.
That's a lot for a 16-year-old.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think sort of finishing off with your opening question then, in a way, Paul, why write this book now? I think a lot of books which try to make Shakespeare feel a little bit more accessible seem to be directed at young people or at students. This is not a book for students or young people. I'm not particularly skilled in how you would get school-age children to like Shakespeare. Actually, this is a book for grown-ups, and sometimes I say the plays that we have thought were suitable for children, like Midsummer Night's Dream, are not at all. They're very grown-up in some exciting and some dangerous ways. Jules, who says the Tempest, I think the Tempest is quite plot low, isn't it? That's what I would not so much like about the Tempest. So I would wonder about Macbeth or Much Ado for those high schoolers who didn't like Romeo and Juliet.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for both of you joining this evening, Professor Paul Gaffney and Emma Smith. It's been a delight. I have to recommend, if anyone, make sure you check the link in the chat to purchase Emma's book from the Learned Owl. I've been reading it and I've been loving it. Been a Shakespeare fan for years, so this was very exciting for me to listen to. Excellent. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure.